The FX3 and FX30 are two of the best video cameras. While these cameras might seem the same on the outside, they're actually very different cameras made for entirely different types of shooters. And you might be surprised to hear this, the more expensive camera isn't necessarily better. So let's do a deep dive and find out which camera is right for you. Also, I'll leave links down below with the best pricing on both of these cameras. Now, one of the biggest misconceptions about the FX3 and the FX30 is that the bodies are exactly the same. I've seen a lot of YouTubers say the exact same thing. But there's actually some key differences in design between these two cameras and the accessories that they come with that can radically change which camera is right for you and also which camera is actually within your budget. I'll explain. Now, these cameras do look similar in the sense that they have the same screen, the same button layout, the built-in fan, even the autofocus and stabilization unit is the same. But the FX3 actually has a physical shutter, whereas the FX30 only has an electronic shutter, which allows the FX3 to be a very capable photo camera, although it is only 12 megapixel sensor, but it can shoot photos as fast as 10 frames per second with 14-bit RAW. And because it's only 12 megapixels, it can shoot unlimited photos. You can shoot up to 999 RAW photos or JPEGs, making the FX3 a really good action camera. The FX30 can only shoot one photo at a time with no burst shooting available, but it can shoot in 14-bit RAW. And because the FX30 doesn't have a physical shutter, you'll also get a little bit of a rolling shutter or that jello effect when taking photos with a moving subject. Now, this won't affect most of you guys that don't shoot photos, but I'm a content creator and I usually need to take something for Instagram or take a YouTube thumbnail. And for something like that, I can use my FX3 because it's already gonna give me really great video, but I can get some pretty decent thumbnails with this camera as well. Now, the biggest difference between these two cameras are actually the accessories that they come with, or rather, don't come with. And depending on how you play your cards, you could actually save about $600 USD. And that is the FX3 and FX30 audio top handle. Not only does this work as a top handle, but it also allows you to get XLR audio directly into your camera. So if you're doing anything like podcasting, interviews where you need top-notch audio, this audio handle is a must-buy. Now, the FX3 always comes with the audio top handle as part of the standard package. And by itself, this top handle is actually $599 USD, but with the FX30, the audio top handle is actually optional. However, if you do buy it with the FX30, it's only an extra $400 USD. So if you know you're eventually going to need this audio top handle, it makes a lot of sense to buy it with your FX30 instead of buying it down the road because you'll actually end up paying an extra $200. And this top handle might actually change which camera you end up buying. Most people will tell you the FX3 is double the price of the FX30, but it's not a $2,100 price difference anymore. It's actually a $1,573 difference, which suddenly makes the FX3 a lot more enticing to buy, which doesn't seem like as big of a bullet to bite if you know you want the FX3, and instead of going for a lower end camera like the FX30, you might as well just spend that extra bit of money and get everything you want on your first purchase. But maybe I'm doing boy math. What do you guys think? I think learning this price difference makes me want to get the FX3 a lot more than the FX30. And if you want to save a little bit of money on your FX3, try buying the FX3 used where you don't have to buy the top handle with it, and you could potentially save about $500 to $600 USD. But before we can decide which camera is right for you, we have to talk about how these cameras actually look. Now, one of the biggest mistakes when it comes to looking at the FX3 and FX30 is that people assume because they're both part of the Sony FX line, they probably have similar photo and video quality and similar capabilities. But in fact, there's a huge technology difference between these two cameras, and they're really meant for two different types of shooters. So let's take a look at who each of these cameras is for. The FX3 has a 12 megapixel full frame sensor, which is going to be fantastic for wide shots, narrative work, and if I do get pretty close to the sensor, you can see that I'm still getting a lot of top room and bottom room, so this is a camera where you just have a lot of room to play around with. Now, with the FX30, as you can see, my shot is not nearly as wide. If I get close to the camera, it's a pretty claustrophobic shot. Now, because of this difference, it's really meant for different shooting styles. So I wouldn't say that this sensor is going to hold you back from doing certain types of work. This is that one sensor, like the full frame sensor, is going to make it easier to get wide shots. The APS-C size sensor is just going to make it tougher and you just have to manage your lenses. However, there is one place where the cheaper FX30 is actually better than the full frame FX3. And that really comes down to resolution. The FX30 has a 26 megapixel sensor, whereas the FX3 has a 12 megapixel sensor. So when it comes to recording video, The FX3 can do 4K at 24, 30, 60, all the way to 120 frames per second, full frame without any compromise in quality or cropping into your sensor. And this is going to give you a native 4K resolution. So when you zoom into my face, it's gonna get a little bit soft. However, standing at the exact same distance from the camera, when I'm in front of the FX30, it's just like a tighter crop on my face, but when you zoom in, you'll also notice that my face has more detail and it's just an overall sharper image because it's a 26 megapixel camera. And on top of that, the 4K at 24, 30, and 60 frames per second is also downsampled from 6K. So your 4K video is really going to have the quality and detail of 6K video, and that might be helpful to some types of shooters. Personally, I feel like 4K is enough for me. The 6K downsampled is nice, but I don't always need it. And the FX3 and FX30 can also shoot 4K at 120 frames per second. The FX3 only has a small 1.2 times crop, which effectively gives you uncompromised 4K at 120 frames per second. The FX30, however, does have a pretty heavy 1.6 times crop on already a smaller APS-C size sensor, which zooms in your image quite a bit. And this mode is best for detail shots and close-ups. And another thing to note is that the FX30 can also shoot full HD up to 120 frames per second, and the FX3 can also shoot full HD at 120 all the way to 240 frames per second, making both of them really good slow motion cameras. But there is one huge difference between these two cameras, and it really comes down to ISO performance and noise levels. The FX3 and the FX30 at standard 800 ISO in S-Log3 should give you a pretty similar image. There might be a bit of difference in exposure, but if you zoom in on my face, the noise level should be pretty even. However, both of these cameras also have a dual native ISO, which is a higher sensitivity ISO that lets you shoot at a higher ISO without getting increased noise in your image. So let's turn both of these cameras to their second native ISO. And now we have the FX30 at 2500 ISO and the FX3 at 12,800 ISO, which is 5 times higher. But both of these cameras should be pretty clean. The FX3 might have a tiny bit of noise, but the FX3 should still be pretty clean because it's only a 2500 ISO. But what happens if I push the FX30 to the same ISO as the FX3? And now we have the FX30 at 12,800 ISO, and if you zoom into my face, chances are this image is looking very noisy and also a little bit soft because of that noise. But the FX3 should be perfectly fine, and I should still get a very crisp and clear image. And that right there is one of the biggest differences between these two cameras, is that the FX3 is just a lot better when it comes to ISO and noise performance than the FX30, which is looking super noisy and soft right now. But with this comparison, you can see that the FX3 is a much better low light camera, and it also makes this camera a lot more flexible when it comes to using your light, because even if you don't have the biggest lights, you can use the FX30, just go to 12,800 ISO and get a lot more out of your lights than compared to the FX30. And the FX3 and FX30 can also shoot in S-Log3 in 10-bit color, so when it comes to actually color grading these video files, you should get very similar results, and it's pretty easy to match up these two cameras. And they both shoot a high bitrate codec that is anywhere between 250 megabits per second to 600 megabits per second, making both of them great cameras for professional video work, which probably isn't too much of a surprise. But the coolest thing about these cameras that I don't see a lot of people talking about is that they can also output a raw signal via this full-size HDMI. So if you have something like an Atomos external recorder, you can actually record ProRes RAW with both of these cameras. So ultimately, who are these cameras for? Because they're actually meant for very different types of shooters. The first thing you have to consider is, do you want a full-frame camera or APS-C? With the FX3, you're going to get a wider field of view, and this is, in my opinion, just easier to work with because I'm already getting such a wide shot. I'm able to get closer to my subject as well while still leaving room at the top and bottom, and it just makes shooting people a lot easier. But if you're shooting things that are further away from you, the FX30 is a much better choice because you're going to get a much more narrow field of view, and you actually get a lot more range from an average lens. Like, this is simply an 18 to 35, but I can basically make this look like a 28 to 55. And it's also pretty easy to get wider lenses for an APS-C sensor, whereas you're probably going to struggle getting wider lenses for a full-frame sensor, and the full-frame sensor lenses are also going to be a lot more expensive than the lenses for an APS-C size sensor. But the really big difference between these two cameras has to be resolution. the FX3 is going to give you native 4K, which in my opinion is a lot because I don't do a lot of cropping and I don't do a lot of digital zooms. But the FX30 is actually going to give you 6K downsampled into 4K, so you're really going to have that level of detail of 6K but in a smaller 4K file. And if you're someone that's going to be doing a lot of cropping or digital zooms, the FX30 image is going to hold up a lot better when you do all that manipulation to it. The frame rates between these two cameras are pretty similar. You're going to get 4K at 24, 30, all the way to 60. Again, the FX30 is downsampled from 6K. The major frame rate difference is the 4K at 120. 4K at 120 on the FX3 has only a very small 1.2 times crop, which you probably won't even notice, but the FX30 has a pretty heavy 1.6 times crop on top of the already cropped sensor, and the 4K 120 on the FX30 is also a lot noisier. So you have to ask yourself, how much are you really shooting 4K at 120? And is it worth the extra money? Now, one thing that might be make or break for a lot of you guys is the low light performance. The FX3 is going to have significantly better low light performance, not only because it has a larger sensor and it's able to gather more light, but on top of that, it has a dual native ISO of 800 and 12,800, whereas the FX30 only has 800 and 2500. So you have to ask yourself, how much low light work am I really doing? If it was 5 years ago, the FX3 would be my choice without a doubt, because I wasn't working with a lot of lighting. But now I'm pretty much always working with studio lighting, and I always have my lights dialed in, and I'm pretty much never doing run and gun work. So honestly, the FX30 might be better for me in most scenarios. The biggest thing for me as a content creator is that I also need photos, and the FX30 is going to let me shoot all my YouTube thumbnails because it can also shoot unlimited frame buffer at 10 frames per second. And if you look at my thumbnails, they're pretty similar, and I'm usually just twisting and turning the camera. So for me, the FX3 is probably going to be my main choice, but if I had a commercial where I know I'm going to be using studio lighting and I know I'm going to want to get those extra digital zoom-ins, the FX30 is probably better. But let me know in the comments down below which of these cameras you guys would pick up and why, based on the type of content you shoot. And if you want to pick up these cameras, I'll leave links down below, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.